But it's a great pleasure today for me to introduce Dr. David Chester, who's from University of Liverpool. He's a geographer, but he's been interested in hazards for quite a long time, several decades, I think.
More than 30 years.
Yep. He's also a priest in the Anglican ministry. And this particular topic of natural disasters, I think, is a really interesting one because it's one that challenges people of faith. They say, how can a good God allow such a terrible thing to happen? But I think it also challenges people of no faith because it challenges the hubris that says we can control our environment at will. So when something comes out of the blue, which shows we can't necessarily, then I think that's a challenge too. So it is a challenge across the spectrum, and we look very much to hearing what you have to say to us today, David. So
well, thank you very much, Paul. This is a field I've been interested in now for 10 years, and it's one of those things that seems to happen in academic life, that what started off just as a kind of peripheral interest, once you publish something, you seem to be asked to do more and more, and it then moves up the list of interests, and I suppose now it's my second research interest to that of actually working on hazard reduction. So it's something that both Angus Duncan, my colleague who's worked on this with me for the last 10 years or more, and myself have really become quite fascinated with, and we are in fact developing the work further, which I can mention at the end of the talk if anyone's interested. So today, this presentation is really an amalgam of many of the things we've been looking at over the last 10 years or so. And what I've done is to, because it's not basically a very visual topic, I've used some PowerPoint illustrations, but it's basically a presentation of a formal talk. I think nearly 40 years ago, John Bowker published his seminal text, Problems of Suffering in the Religions of the World, in which he argued that the issue of innocent suffering was a prominent theme in most of the world's religions, and especially in Christianity and Judaism, arguments used to reconcile the concept of a loving and omniscient God who treats his creatures with justice and the simultaneous existence of evil and suffering is termed theodicy. I'm sure I don't need to tell the audience here, because I'm sure you know it already, that the term was first introduced into philosophical discourse by Leibniz more than 200 years ago. Although attempts to understand the reasons why innocent people suffer have exercised the minds of philosophers and theologians for thousands of years, being notable features of the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, works of early Christian writers, in particular Augustine and Irenaeus, and some of the greatest subsequent Christian writers within Christian history, including Immanuel Kant, David Hume, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Karl Barth, C.S. Lewis, John Hick, James Crenshaw, Dorothy Soule, John Severino, and many others. Although in recent years most discussions of theodicy within the Judeo-Christian tradition have been concerned with suffering caused by humans to humans, for instance violence against individuals, warfare, genocide, and in particular in recent decades the Holocaust, there's an established tradition of studying what are termed natural evils, which include sickness, bereavement, as well as disasters following in the wake of extreme events of nature. Philosophical theology is based on the exercise of human reason in the context of an engagement with Scripture, which is perceived as the revealed Word of God. And within the Leibnizian tradition, there are a number of models of theodicy which are either based on or may be supported by Scripture. What I first want to do is look at the Scripture and the theodicy of what's often called retribution, or divine wrath. Biblical narratives focus on the Holy Land, present-day Israel, Palestine, but allude to a much more extensive area covering lands that border the eastern Mediterranean and which encompass much of the Middle East. And this large region is notable for its history of disasters, which include droughts, storms and floods, as well as earthquakes and volcanic activity. And in this address, and for reasons of brevity, because I know most about it, I want to just focus on earthquakes and volcanic eruptions by way of illustration. And frequent and damaging earthquakes have occurred in the Holy Land on many occasions. And active volcanism didn't occur in Palestine either during the biblical era or subsequently, but it's a feature of several other areas mentioned in Scripture. So if we look at the first couple of PowerPoint slides, you can see that the whole of the Holy Land is indeed crisscrossed by active faults. And the dates on this illustration, this piece of artwork, are ones where there have been historic eruptions, historic earthquakes. And many of the areas that are mentioned on this slide are ones in which there's reference in Scripture to events that may or may not have been caused by earthquakes. And if we look at the wider Middle East, you can see that there are volcanoes of various dates, some dated, some occurring in historic times, some in prehistoric times. But nevertheless, as I'll mention in a few moments, many of these are events that are alluded to in the biblical record. So the principal earthquakes and instances of possible volcanic activity that are mentioned in the Old Testament can be listed, and the effects of these and other disasters are used by the authors of the Hebrew Bible to support its dominant theodicy that disasters represent punishment of humans sinful by a God who is often characterized as being wrathful. And if we draw on an exegesis of many Old Testament passages, I think it allows three summary statements to be made about the relationship between the divine will and human suffering. First of all, the principal distinction is between the suffering of Israel, God's chosen people, and the suffering of individuals. And it's not really between suffering caused by natural disasters and those through human agency. And secondly, that the people who suffer are wicked and sinful, with God controlling alike the fates of people and nations. And thirdly, for individuals, the suffering of innocent Job is normative, and even Job's friends cannot believe that he's totally innocent and must be harbouring some secret sin. Richard Bauckham highlights how authors in the Old Testament frequently make use of earthquake imagery to highlight theophanies, in which God is made manifest to his, her people. Frequently, he writes, the creation shakes before the coming of God as warrior, leading his host to battle against his enemies, before the coming of God to reign over nations, and before the coming of God to judge the wicked. And in some Old Testament pseudepigrapha, Bauckham has also argued that texts point to a cataclysmic earthquake, which will usher in a final manifestation of God at the end of time, an event which is known in biblical studies as the eschatological theophany. As in the Old Testament, so in the New, theophany and eschatology are prominent ways in which earthquake imagery is employed. With the ground shaking that accompanied the crucifixion, the seismic activity which moved the stone from Christ's tomb, and the earthquake that opened the doors of the prison in which the apostles Paul and Silas were incarcerated, all being examples of the former. And eschatological imagery is also to be found in the Gospels and in the Revelation of St. John. Reference to volcanic eruption, or to a volcanic eruption, may in fact occur in the book of Revelation at 1621, where hail of stones according to some translations, dropped from heaven on people until they cursed God for the plague of the hail. And this has been suggested by some to be allusion to fall deposits, in other words tephra, from the AD 79 eruption of Vesuvius, which most famously destroyed Pompeii. It's also possible that it was a devout Jew who scratched on the wall of a house in Pompeii the words Sodom and Gomorrah. Even thousands of years later, the Sodom and Gomorrah event was still being associated with destructive natural phenomena. The events described in the New Testament occurred predominantly in the first century of the Christian era, and explanations of suffering caused by natural and human agency display both a continuity with and a development of the Old Testament retributive theodicy. In Mark 2, 1-12, paralleled in Matthew 9, 2 and Luke 5, before Jesus heals the paralytic, he first forgives the man his sins, so implying an Old Testament retributive theodicy. It's not made clear, however, whether this particular man was especially guilty because of his wrongdoing. But the most focused treatment of the issue of suffering and so-called natural evil occurs in two incidents that are recorded in the Gospels. In the first, the disciples ask Jesus whether the cause of a man's blindness from birth is his sin or that of his parents, in John 9:2. While the second, and referring to 18 people who have been killed due to the collapse of the Tower of Siloam, Jesus asked the rhetorical question, do you think they were worse offenders than all others living in Jerusalem? In the first incident, Jesus upbraids the disciples, and so doing appears to go against the Old Testament teacher. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's work might be revealed in him. While in the second Lucan example, Jesus answers his own rhetorical question. No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish just as they did. Both these passages are somewhat difficult to interpret. In the case of the blind man, it seems undeserved, indeed iniquitous, that he should have had to endure suffering so that he could be healed by Jesus. While in the Siloam incident, Jesus crucially introduces the notion of collective as opposed to individual guilt, a distinction which has important implications for what we've called post-Leibnizian theodicy. In the period between the emergence of Christianity as a major world religion and the early 19th century, the explanation of major disasters that eclipsed all others with these phenomena were either manifestations of divine power sent to punish human sinfulness and or presage the end of the world. And it's not difficult to find support for this statement because the study of historical disasters within societies with a dominant Christian ethos has indeed generated a vast literature. Making use of the literature on historical eruptions and earthquakes, this consensus of academic scholarship has been highly critical of the impact of Christianity and its retributive theodicy on human understanding of natural perils. And the period between the rise of Christianity as the officially sanctioned faith of the Roman Empire under Constantine and the later 18th century is often considered a long dark age in which superstition largely replaced the search for explanation of natural phenomena which had been nascent in the classical period. According to this reading of intellectual history, the spread of Christianity largely eclipsed the albeit nascent naturalistic explanations of volcanoes and earthquakes that had been proposed by writers in the classical age. And it was only from the time of the European Renaissance, especially during and following the 18th century Enlightenment, that retributive religious explanations of disasters became less prominent, to be superseded progressively by more scientific and social scientific explanations of extreme natural events and their impacts on vulnerable populations. It is argued further that this change first occurred in Europe and North America and later spread to other parts of the Christianized world, with the 1755 Lisbon earthquake marking a watershed. Not only did this earthquake at the same time shock and fascinate the educated classes of Europe and North America, but it also stimulated a fierce debate between those who saw the hand of God in the disaster and those who proposed purely naturalistic explanations. Striking Lisbon and other areas of southern Portugal, southern Spain and North Africa, on the morning of All Saints' Day, 1755, the 2nd of November, many people attending church were either killed by falling masonry, and hundreds of buildings, including many that were of religious foundation, were destroyed when fires were kindled by altar candles and houses collapsed on kitchen hearths. Such catastrophic losses led many commentators to ascribe the earthquake to divine wrath visited on the sinful people of Portugal. This group singled out for particular opprobrium, being the people a particular writer wished to blame. For example, one Jesuit, Father Gabriel Malagrida, claimed the earthquake was punishment for the Inquisition not being sufficiently severe, while in contrast, and writing from a Protestant perspective from the safety of England, John Wesley blamed the disaster on the Inquisition's excesses. And all these explanations were again challenged by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in the late 18th century was a pioneer in defining disaster as a social construct involving an interaction between an earthquake and a vulnerable population, without the necessity for any divine agency. Scholars embracing this conventional wisdom conclude by arguing that today the last redoubts of religious explanations of disaster are either to be found in extreme biblical literalist Christian circles within what might be termed economically more developed countries, or in those societies within economically less developed countries which are relatively untouched by the forces of modernism. And in a sense, in order to test the veracity of this conventional wisdom, Angus Duncan and I have studied religious reactions to major earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that have occurred between 1900 and 2008 in countries with a predominantly Christian ethos. And this catalogue represents an attempt to recover what has been termed, what we have termed indeed, the hidden history of responses, because accounts which are cast in the language of faith communities are often frequently eliminated from official records and peer-reviewed international academic science and social science journals. And recovery of these records requires the interrogation of newspapers of record, use of more anthropologically based studies, and the study of local archives. And notwithstanding these issues, it's significant that of the 61 discrete events recorded in our catalogue, which have caused major losses, 72% showed clear evidence of responses being couched in religious terms by some people who have been affected by those events. And a figure that would be probably even higher if local records could be interrogated for information on some of the earlier events of the time series. For example, reports of the 1902 and 1929 earthquakes in Guatemala show no evidence of religious responses, yet more detailed reports of the 1976 earthquake disaster imply that the religious explanations were at the time both deep-seated and of long-standing within Guatemalan society. One element of the conventional wisdom that can be supported is that a biblical literalist retributive theodicy declined rapidly following the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, especially in what may be described today as economically more developed countries, though elements of it remain both in these societies and also in many which are economically less developed. In Great Britain and other countries which saw rapid industrial growth and major scientific advance from the late 18th century, progressively fewer Christians accepted explanations that involved divine retribution. But even today, notions of divine wrath are still embraced by a small minority of biblical literalists and conservative evangelicals. Following the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami disaster, for example, a fierce debate raged in the religious press, some of you may remember it, over the fact that a retributive theodicy was still being proposed by some Christians to explain this event and its impact. When faced with disasters that are perceived as being caused by processes that are more extreme than might be expected or have been experienced within living memory, there's a well-documented tendency for Christian commentators, some of whom are normally most reluctant to invoke divine responsibility, atavistically to revert to a retributive theodicy. In commenting, for instance, on the British floods of 2007, some Christians, for instance, drew a direct link between British sexual lifestyles, divine judgment and flooding, although subsequently Graham Dow, Bishop of Carlisle, and the most prominent Christian quote in the press as holding such opinions, did indeed provide a more finely nuanced statement in partial rebuttal by claiming that he had been originally inaccurately reported. Nevertheless, other letters in the religious press didn't think the bishop went far enough in rejecting his earlier explanation. And of course, a retributive theodicy with liturgies of propitiation, parades of sacred relics and votive objects, and numerous other ritualistic actions to appease divine wrath is also still a feature of what has been termed popular Catholicism, as encountered in places as diverse as southern Italy and Sicily, on the slopes of many volcanoes in South America, where there's often a syncretic relationship between Catholicism and earlier pre-Columbian faiths, and following the earthquakes in El Salvador in 1986, and indeed in the Philippines following the 1991 Pinatubo volcanic eruption. Although within the context of disasters, therefore, retribution is far less common today as an explanation than it was in the past, there is no evidence to support the contention that naturalistic explanations of death, injury and destruction have completely replaced those grounded within religious frames of reference within the Christian tradition. What is evident is that other models of theodicy, while not fully superseding the retributive, have become much more common. Although all the theodicies I'll list in a moment on the following PowerPoint have been employed in discussions of human-induced suffering, in studies of natural calamities, the best of all possible worlds, also known as the Irenaean model, has been particularly important. And the next few overheads merely go through some of the various models of theodicy that have been defined within the Leibnizian tradition. There's the dualist model, God and evil in conflict, people must make a decision. Only good comes from God, suffering from an anti-God. There's the free will, the sometimes called the Augustinian model. Suffering is related to the freedom granted by God to humankind, but freedom has the potential to be misused. There's the best of all possible worlds, the Irenaean model. The world is governed by natural laws and is the best world that could be created. A world without pain would be a world that operated according to providence rather than the laws of physics. Without earthquakes there'd be no mountains, without volcanoes no planetary atmospheres. There's the existential model, in a sense similar to the dualist and best of all possible worlds. Good may come out of tragedy, meaning must be found in suffering. And then there's the model I've already mentioned at some length, the model of retribution, that suffering is God's punishment for human sinfulness. And there's finally a kind of post-Newtonian model, what's sometimes characterized as the chaotic model. The laws of physics do not describe a stationary, predictable world, but a chaotic one. Now, just while I've got the PowerPoint on, these are just some examples of extreme geophysical events recorded in the Hebrew Bible. It's merely a list, it's a selected list. There are many others as well that you could pull out, or there are others that can be pulled out. I don't want to go through these in any great detail. Anyone who's interested, I can always send them a paper of where these are discussed in some detail later. That's the next bit. The best of all possible worlds model of theodicy is most commonly associated with Voltaire and his reactions to the Lisbon earthquake in the context of natural disasters. And in his novel Candide and in his poem on the disaster, Voltaire alludes to a best of all possible worlds theodicy and is clearly of the opinion that destructive forces are built into the very structure of the universe, with Dr. Pangloss, Candide's tutor, accepting nature's fate even when faced with almost complete devastation. Summarising this model, the theologian F.J. Murphy concludes, and I quote, it would probably be impossible to design any system in nature which did not have the potential to injure unsuspecting humans, and that God's purpose is to accept disasters and use them to complete a greater good. The association of the best of all possible worlds theodicy with St. Irenaeus implies correctly that it predates Voltaire by many centuries, and in fact it finds support in Scripture, in the history of Christian responses to disaster, and in the records of events that have occurred in our own catalogue since 1900. Although the Hebrew Bible is generally unwilling to admit there can be any wholly innocent suffering, some biblical scholars have argued that there are a number of exceptions to this generalization, for instance in Proverbs 3 and Hosea 11. Within the epistles of the New Testament, the most significant treatment of a greater good is the discussion of passages from the Old Testament book of Proverbs, indeed Proverbs 3:11 to 12, by the anonymous author of the Epistle to the Hebrews. In the Hebrews 12, the Greek word that's usually translated as discipline has traditionally been interpreted as implying rebuke or punishment, and so has been used to support a theodicy of retribution. But the word may also have the sense of positive teaching and training that loving parents give their children in a whole range of circumstances. And the theme of suffering having a moral purpose is taken further in the first epistle of Peter, chapter 4. Here suffering occurs inter alia to prove the reality of faith, to share Christ's suffering and to glorify God. And over the centuries there have been many instances of monks and ascetics inflicting suffering on themselves as a means of spiritual discipline. For the theologian John Hick, suffering is a learning experience and a process of soul-making, which also involves showing God's glory in compassionate love and self-giving for others, and this constitutes the highest value of all. Reflecting on these and other passages, Austin Farrer, one of the comparatively few 20th century theologians who have been concerned with natural perils, as opposed to those caused to humans by humans, sums up the best of all possible worlds theodicy in the context of natural disasters, using two often quoted sections from his book, A Science of God. Here's the first of them. If an earthquake shakes down a city, an urgent practical problem arises: how to rescue, feed, house and console the survivors, rehabilitate the injured and commend the dead to the mercy of God. Thus immediately how to reconstruct in a way which will minimise the effects of another disaster. But no theological problem arises. The will of God expressed in this event is his will for the physical elements in the earth's crust or under it. His will that they should go on being themselves and acting according with their natures. And the second quotation is this one from page 90 of the same book. It's not then that the humanly inconvenient byproducts of volcanic fire are cushioned or diverted. It is not that all harms to man are prevented, no politically correct terminology in his day. It is that the creative work of God never ceases, that there is always something his providence does, even for the most tragically stricken. I think those sum it up very well indeed. And within historical earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, many examples of the use of the best of all possible worlds theodicy may be found. For instance, two small earthquakes struck London on February the 8th and March the 8th, 1750. And although the majority of clergy preached a theodicy of divine wrath visited on the sinful people of Britain, one group believed that only some earthquakes were sent to punish, while a third, albeit a small minority, adopted a best of all possible worlds position. In the 19th century, in preaching on the occasion of a national day of fasting in 1832, Bishop Maltby of Chichester castigated those who saw the hand of providence in all manner of calamities, while the reaction of the majority of clergy to earthquakes later in the century was strongly based on explanations grounded in the acceptance of natural processes. The earthquakes in Venice in 1873 and Colchester in England in 1884 being very good examples. Reactions of Christian laity and clergy to more recent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions has often reflected the twin elements contained within the writings of Austin Farrer, of recognising first such events as the outcomes of natural processes, while secondly at the same time seeing them as calls to intercessory prayer for victims and for Christian social action. And there are many examples of intercessory prayer and Christian help for victims, going back to New Testament times, when severe famines occurred in Palestine. One such event took place during the reign of Claudius, and the apostles sent disaster relief to fellow Christians living in Judea, as we read in Acts 11. And this tradition of charity has continued and has been a feature to many historic and contemporary earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Under both a retributive and best of all possible worlds theodicy, Christian practice is justified by the commandment to love one's neighbours and by seeing the suffering of Christ in the distress of the disaster victims. But I will submit there is a danger, however, with Christians adopting a best of all possible worlds theodicy. And this, I think, is highlighted in a thoughtful and highly critical review of a conservative evangelically inspired manual on disaster relief entitled Christian Perspectives on Disaster Management by Ian Davis and Michael Wall, which was published in 1992. In a very thoughtful review of this book, Hugo Slim makes the important point that following a disaster, there is a danger when the greater good is narrowly defined as the opportunities that may arise if relief aid is used as a kind of lever to assist in the process of conversion, because such a perspective comes perilously close to the concept of a good disaster, far removed from the greater good as it's been defined classically in Christian theology. In the 1970s, research on disasters was mainly carried out under the banner of what has been termed in the social sciences the dominant approach, which sought to emphasise the deployment of scientific and technological interventions to mitigate the effects of natural calamities. And this approach was first introduced by the pioneer American hazard analyst Gilbert Fowler White in the 1940s to study flooding and reactions to flooding in the USA, and was later extended to embrace other hazards across a wide range of countries and hazard types. This theological study of natural perils was focused also within the Leibnizian tradition, where the best of all possible worlds model had become progressively more important over the preceding 2 centuries. Paradigm shifts, however, occurred in both academic fields at approximately the same time, starting in the 1980s and gathering momentum in the 1990s. And these final 10 years of the millennium coincided with the United Nations designation of that decade as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. In the case of research on disasters, the dominant approach became the subject of trenchant criticism. Briefly, the dominant approach accepts that factors such as differences in systems of belief, material wealth, previous experience of hazardous events, and psychological factors may be of importance in affecting human responses. It nevertheless emphasised the role of environmental extremes as the principal determinants of disaster. In contrast, by the final decades of the 20th century, greater weight was being placed on human vulnerability. It was argued cogently and with increasing force that most of the mortality and morbidity in disasters, especially in economically less developed countries, could be explained by factors such as poverty, deprivation, marginalisation, lack of disaster preparedness, and in the case of earthquakes, by collapsing buildings constructed to inadequate or non-existent codes. For example, in the 20th century, some 99%, or around 99%, of volcano-related deaths have occurred in countries we might roughly classify as economically less developed, while examination of the impacts of earthquakes of similar magnitude showed a similar disparate pattern, with major death tolls increasingly becoming the preserve of the world's poor, whereas financial losses were the most striking feature of rich countries such as our own. However, when financial impacts are expressed as a percentage of national wealth, using gross domestic product or gross national product, then the relative toll imposed on poor countries is far higher and may indeed, in major disasters, be many percentage points of gross domestic product. For theodicy, the paradigm shift has been even more significant because the Leibnizian tradition, which represents over 2,000 years of theological reflection on the relationships between God, natural processes and human suffering, if not superseded, now has a well-supported competitor. And from the 1980s, an increasing number of theologians have found the Leibnizian models increasingly unconvincing and have constructed new theodicies which require both a renewed engagement with Scripture and intense theological reflection on disasters. And there are several strands to this new thinking. First, as we've already noted, when the Tower of Siloam collapsed, Jesus introduces the notion that guilt may be collective and not necessarily individual. He also teaches that punishment was not arbitrarily visited on individuals who perished, because they were no more to blame than other people living in Jerusalem, as we read in Luke 13, verses 4 and 5. And there are numerous historical examples where this theme of collective responsibility is mentioned by Christians, but not fully developed. In 1382, for instance, Archbishop Courtney called a meeting of the council in Blackfriars to decide what action to take against the Oxford theologian John Wycliffe and his followers, the Lollards, who were seeking to reform the church and thereby threaten church order. And the occurrence of the 1382 earthquakes encouraged some bishops to believe that God disapproved of the institutional church and his planned actions against Lollardy. But Archbishop Courtney stood firm and drew the opposite conclusion, that the earthquake was a sign which supported the status quo. Know you not that the noxious vapours which catch fire in the bosom of the earth and give rise to these phenomena which alarm you lose all their force when burst forth? In like manner, by rejecting the wicked from our community, we shall put an end to the convulsions of the church. And another example of guilt being collective rather than personal emerges from John Wesley's reflections on the Lisbon earthquake. For Wesley, the earthquake represented divine retribution for the sins of the Inquisition. But the idea of human sinfulness, institutional rather than individual, and stripped of its retributive and sectarian overtones, may be a more significant insight than was recognised at the time or subsequently. And the second strand within post-Leibnizian theodicy emphasises the immanence of God with human affairs. Terence Tilley, for instance, argues that the Leibnizian approach, the traditional approach, is a means of reducing human responsibility for both natural and human-induced suffering, because it focuses responsibility on God rather than people, on creator rather than on creature. And this line of argument may also be seen in the work of two highly influential writers. The first of whom is the Jesuit Raymond Schwager, who shows that there's both a biblical and historical tendency within Christianity to make God the scapegoat for all manner of human failings. And also in the work of Ten Steinberg, a secular historian of the environment, who in reviewing disasters in the United States over the period from the War of Independence through the 19th century right up to the present day, argues that the perception of such events as being caused by either malign nature or by God are both convenient devices for both commercial interests and the institutions of government, who can thereby evade responsibility for the poor, the racially disadvantaged, and other marginalised groups within American society. And indeed, many have argued that in the New Orleans disaster of a couple of years ago, we could see all those elements occurring within that particular event. So by combining notions of collective guilt, structural, that is, institutional sinfulness, and human responsibility, it's proved possible for us to propose what we've termed a liberationist theodicy. This involves a reworking of the classic Leibnizian free will defence, with human freedom not only being expressed at the level of the individual, but also collectively with respect to greed at the national, international and corporate levels. And this structural sinfulness, so we have argued, lies behind global disparities in wealth and poverty, as it does in dissimilar and unequal disaster outcomes. Structural sinfulness was also identified by the liberation theologians from the 1970s, where it was viewed as a process which kept the poor and disadvantaged in a state of subjection. Beginning with the 1970 earthquake in Peru, and especially in South America, has been intense theological reflection on earthquake losses in virtually every subsequent event, particularly by the Catholic writer John Sobrino. And a third strand in the post-Leibnizian theodicy stresses the immanence of God over against divine transcendence, with the crucifixion of Jesus and the doctrine of the Trinity being seen as crucially important. And according to liberationist theology and theodicy, Jesus Christ, the crucified God, demonstrates how God suffers vicariously with and for all his children. And to quote Jürgen Moltmann, to think of God as impassible would surely be to fall short of the God revealed in Jesus Christ, a God of love who participates in the suffering of his creatures and is perhaps the greatest sufferer of all. And often the doctrine of the Trinity is invoked to demonstrate how God shares not only in the suffering of his Son on the cross of Calvary, but also with all suffering humanity, who are linked to God by a shared parenthood. Finally, this liberationist theodicy is a partial theodicy, because the possibility of disaster losses cannot be wholly eliminated. Even in the most well-planned societies, people still suffer. And in this, albeit small minority of cases, recourse still has to be made either to a classic Leibnizian model, or to a reworking of one or more of them. A free will approach which is highly germane, I would submit to you, to people living in hazard-prone areas in economically more developed parts of the world, has recently been proposed by Frank Murphy. And he argues that in such countries, people often make a free choice, either informed or uninformed, to live in an earthquake or an eruption-prone location. And since God cannot have foreseen their decision, he cannot prevent suffering caused when disaster strikes. For instance, the elderly Harry Truman, not the president but a resident, well-documented action in 1980 not to heed the warnings to evacuate his property on the flanks of Mount St. Helens was his uninformed choice, whereas the informed choice would have been to follow the advice of the authorities and so to reduce his vulnerability. Finally, just a number of concluding remarks. In studying evacuations carried out in connection with a range of disasters, the hazard researcher David Alexander has pointed out that no plan is likely to be 100% successful, but the reasons for the instructions of the civil authorities being resisted are indeed unlikely to be religious. Reasons may be individualistic, as in the case of Harry Truman quoted above, or collective, as in the case of the residents on the flanks of Fonash volcano in San Miguel Island in the Azores. In this predominantly agricultural and strongly Catholic area, a study we carried out 10 years ago of possible reactions to people to a future eruption warning uncovered a resistance to evacuate, which was based on a strong attachment to a land, farm and pedigree livestock herds built up over several generations. Religious beliefs were not an important factor in discouraging people from moving. Also, the fact that the city of Saint-Pierre on Martinique in the Caribbean was not evacuated in advance of the 1902 eruption, in spite of the increasingly threatening activity of Mont Pelée volcano, had little to do with religion, but rather reflected the governor's desire not to postpone an imminent election, and the fact that a previous eruption in 1851 had merely covered Saint-Pierre with a thin layer of ash. Many Conservative voters lived in Saint-Pierre, and the governor didn't want any of them to leave. One feature to emerge from our study of historic eruptions and earthquakes over the course of the past century is that Christian belief has neither inhibited more practical measures being taken to reduce hazard exposure, nor has it prevented people accepting help from the civil authorities. Believing in two mutually incompatible explanations, or holding one view yet acting contrary to it, is often termed parallel practice, sometimes I realise now inaccurately termed cognitive dissonance. although that's not prevented me using that term in some earlier publications, although I've been upbraided by some psychologists for using it. So we've got a new term. And this is a particular feature of many closely studied reactions to societies with a popular Catholic ethos. For instance, in southern Italy, there's no evidence to suggest that a strong adherence to the rituals and beliefs of popular Catholicism has prevented people obeying the authorities over such measures of evacuation. This behaviour being a good example, perhaps, of individuals hedging their bets. Even when people have embraced a retributive theodicy, there is additionally no evidence from the records we've collected that outside help has been resisted. Not within the Christian tradition, but in some other religious traditions it has. But I'm not talking about that today. When the occurrence of parallel practice is combined with a post-Leibnizian liberationist theology and new, more vulnerability-focused approaches to hazards from the social sciences, it is possible to see at the moment certain synergies developing. Civil defence planners can now more easily make use of the often substantial financial and human resources of Christian denominations and their associated charities. Virtually every community in a country with a Christian history has a church, which is not only a religious focus but a social one as well, with clergy acting as a useful resource in identifying victims and providing counselling, relief and leadership. Under a liberationist approach, the presence of the divine is located in the disaster victims and is not perceived as being within the geological processes or the geophysical processes that caused the earthquake or volcanic eruption. And this new perspective is already informing Christian attitudes towards disaster relief, being enthusiastically embraced by international Christian charities which seek to provide disaster relief and assist economic development. If one looks on the websites for Christian Aid or Cathos or any of these other Christian development charities, you can really see that point emerging very strongly within those websites. Just a couple of things to finish with. Here's the quotation I mentioned, which I should have put up on a PowerPoint. This is the quotation at the Blackfriars Conference from Bishop Courtney, which I actually read out. And finally, this is a slide from a paper we published on the 1944 eruption of Vesuvius, which in fact was never properly written up in terms of its reactions, because it occurred during wartime. And we got some money some years ago to interview some of the principal actors who were still alive who had been involved in that disaster relief. And it was associated with, even in wartime, with quite elaborate rituals of propitiation. Here's a local patron saint being carried in procession. And despite the fact that many people felt it was God's wrath, that didn't affect them when it came to evacuation of dangerous sites on the flanks of the volcano. I've got hundreds of these pictures. I can bore people for a long time. But that is actually the end. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David. We've got a good 10 minutes for any questions or comments that people have. Does anybody want to kick off? While you gather your thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I found your talk extremely interesting, and particularly this notion of the collective nature and the social nature. I thought that was really good. And I just wonder, this is a beastly question.
Yeah.
If you were Dr. Pangloss, and you were standing next to that dying girl's deathbed, and you were asked the question, why is this happening? How could you bring in these notions of the social and collective, and how would you answer?
Well, I mean, that's basically the pastoral sensitivity of the Christian, isn't it? You know, you've got to commend somebody as a child of God, and you've got to, in a sense, allow a person time to say what they want to say. I mean, in a sense, that's the test of Christian ministry in a way. I think it's incredibly difficult, and I know that I I know that from pastoral ministry, I think it'd be very, very difficult to do bereavement counselling unless you've got some theology of human suffering that you could actually share with people if you were asked. But I'm quite sure. I mean, I've had it in pastoral ministry. Why has my child died? Why us? Why has it happened to us? And you've just got to work with that couple in that particular situation, and it's very difficult. But I've found that if you allow enough time, you can actually make these points, and you can certainly make them at the funeral. But it's not easy. And personally, I think it's actually the greatest test for the Christian, really, to deal with what appears to be arbitrary and unexpected death, but particularly of a young person. I'm not saying I've got all the answers. I haven't. In a sense, I think I'm only just asking the questions, but I think that's not really an answer to your question. I know.
But it was basic.
But yeah.
Thank you. Well, people, just thinking, can I just throw in, if I've understood you rightly, you pointed out institutional sinfulness, if you like, is responsible for a lot of the suffering, a lot of the deaths. For those that aren't, you've brought in the free will defence, if you like, that they've chosen to live somewhere dangerous, nothing God could do about that. But it seems to me there is still the case of people that are living somewhere where they had no possible knowledge of the fact that something nasty was going to happen just there.
Yeah. And
yet they die. Now, how do you address that issue?
Well, I think you've got to address it just simply through one of the classic defences. My talk really is, in a sense, a counterblast to what I think is, to what often is not very well stated, that there is a very strong institutional and structural element in the majority of disasters.
Yeah, certainly I agree.
But I think, I can't even begin to answer the question of why some innocent people died. That's something that's very, very difficult. And you can, in a sense, talk about these various defences, these various models. But ultimately, many things are in the hands of God, and you've no idea why these occur. I think the central point of my presentation is the fact that there is actually a human tendency, and there's been a long-term human tendency to, in fact, scapegoat God for a lot of human failings, and that and there's no way you can blame God for the vast majority of disasters that occur in the third world.
Yeah, absolutely. Point's very well taken.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
It's fascinating, thank you. The motivation of these people in the photograph, on your last point, could it be that it wasn't just propitiation? People tend to mix motives and varied motives among them, but actually an expression of faith, because whatever practical steps you're going to take in a disaster, who do you turn to first?
And of course there is that's the traditional way they've done it. That's how they've always done it. So that's the way. A human tendency is, when faced with something that's extreme, you react in the same way that you've always reacted to it. It's very interesting that some of the people, this is just a sidelight really, some of the people, I've just realised that a couple of the people on this slide are people we actually interviewed. That person here, we actually interviewed him. He's an old man now. But that's a good point actually.
Yeah.
I think I would just like to suggest that there might be a functional, if not purpose, at least result of such an activity, and that would be the fellowship of people involved.
The fellowship?
The fellowship.
Yeah.
The need for fellowship exists independent, I think, or at least the fact that people find fellowship strengthening and attractive exists independently of the religion and culture, and it provides a clear opportunity.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's something we haven't actually looked at all. In fact, the very interesting thing about the Italian case is that if you try and approach this issue using questionnaire survey, you don't get anywhere. Because people will never say there's a religious dimension. Because they're actually frightened to admit it in front of universities trained, particularly foreign academics. Whereas if you ask them in interview, if you do it in in-depth interview, they're only too pleased to say, because they see that as being a little more informal. But that idea of fellowship did come out in some of the interviews we carried out on Vesuvius. That's right. But I've never done anything with that, and that's actually a very good point. And that wasn't part of the research we were doing. So in fact, but I mean, it's a point well made.
Yeah, because it's notorious or famous that happened in one case of human-induced disaster, namely the London Blitz. That sense of fellowship arose from that.
Yeah. But there's quite a literature on human-induced disasters in the UK.
Yeah, so people have actually looked back on those periods, which traumatic and awful they were, but in some sense, not quite the best years of their life, but some that had very precious to it. I mean, I think you're exactly right. Yeah.
I remember externally a PhD about 10 years ago, and she'd made use of the Mass Observation Archive, and this was flood losses in the UK, and that's one thing that did actually come out of that particular study.
As a rather trivial example, it's notoriously difficult to speak to strangers in South East England. I remember being on a coach once when there was something happened and the back window was smashed. Nobody was hurt, but for the rest of that journey it was like a party. Everybody was talking to complete strangers. It was wonderful.
Yes.
Do you see epidemics in the same sort of classes? Disaster?
I suppose I do, yes. I've never thought of it really.
1918 flu epidemic was possibly the greatest.
Yeah. Or what we might be facing.
Disaster.
Yeah.
But we don't know what's coming now.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I could have actually expanded the talk to look at other types of phenomena, but in fact, it was just too much to do. But I've never actually worked on epidemics. But I've worked on flooding, but I didn't actually include that today.
I mean, the interesting point about modern worries about epidemics is that they're spread so rapidly by human technology, airplanes and people moving around, isn't it? So you can certainly construct a theodicy that has some human element in the responsibility for it, I guess. Yeah, we just got a couple of minutes.
Would you say there's a very strong Christian motivation to try and mitigate the effects of earthquakes? Much of the damage is done due to collapsing structures, and therefore there's a very real need there. Also in understanding the nature of earthquakes, maybe even predicting so on.
Yeah. Well, that's my main area of research is hazard reduction. And one thing Angus and I are doing is to expand the work now to it's just happened in a kind of serendipitous way in a way, but because we've been asked to do it, but we're doing some work now in the Middle East, and particularly beginning to look at how disasters are viewed within Islam. So we've actually got a research student who's paid for by the Dubai government, who's looking at these issues. That's the next stage of the work, really.
Good. Can we take one last question from Hilary, then we should...
That leads into my question actually, which was to wonder if in your research with Christian communities you came across an element that isn't exactly blaming God, but it's what I call more fatalism, the fact that one person dies and another doesn't. It's just que sera kind of thing. I mean, is that a strong... Well,
I actually included that in a book chapter that's part of this work, but it was one of those things where I'm not actually sure I agree with the conclusion of the paper now. So I've actually didn't highlight it today, because we did go into fatalism and particularly into other world religions. But it's a terrible thing to admit, really. But I'm actually surprised it got through the refereeing now, because I'm actually quite critical of it. I don't think it's actually. I think it's a bit half-baked, to be honest. So that's something I think we need to revisit in our work. But that's certainly a feature within Islam. Yeah. Although there again, it's. I mean, working with one of the joint supervisors of this work, who was actually an Islamic scholar. It's much more finely nuanced than I thought it was when I started work on it, as things invariably are.
Good, well that's the moment we ought to stop because people have other things to get to, but let's thank David yet again for